People ask me what the Drashari were like, and I always say, imagine someone who has never once, in 4,000 years of recorded political history, been told no. Then imagine meeting that someone at a negotiating table and realizing they don't understand the word exists. That's the Drashari Queendom. I'd been sitting across from them for 8 months when Queen Sarithval finally decided she was done with the slow approach. My name is Thomas Okafor. I was 61 years old when the compact sent me to the Dresden Accord Summit, which was the Drashari's name for the negotiation process, and which translated more precisely as the formality before the obvious conclusion. I had 34 years in the diplomatic service. I'd worked 4 first contact situations, 2 war termination frameworks, and 1 particularly memorable 8-year infrastructure rights dispute with the Pelari Collective that I still occasionally dream about, not pleasantly. I was not new to this work. The compact sent me alone. No staff, no junior attachés, no assistant envoys. Just me, my translation implant, and a single carry case of documentation that the Drashari court found privately hilarious from the moment I walked through the gate. I should note that the decision to send one person was not, as the Drashari court appeared to assume, an indication that the compact failed to understand the significance of the occasion. It was a deliberate choice, and not my first time in this particular configuration. There is a school of thought in the compact diplomatic service, not a fashionable school, but a persistent one, that large delegations in early-stage negotiations create as many problems as they solve. More people means more divergent interpretations of what was said. More people means internal alignment becomes as much of a challenge as external negotiation. More people means the other side is always watching your team as much as they're watching you, looking for the cracks. One person is simpler. One person has one position and one set of notes and one consistent account of every session. The other side always knows exactly what they're dealing with. The Drashari court found it hilarious anyway. I didn't mind. I know that I'm not an impressive figure in the way that large delegations are impressive. I'm a medium-height man of 61 with gray at his temples and a carry case that looks like it belongs in a commercial archive. I had learned a long time ago to be comfortable being underestimated. It keeps things moving. Not directly, of course. Drashari court protocol is extremely formal. But their secondary eyelids, the translucent inner lids that slide across horizontally when they're suppressing an expression, flickered in a particular rhythm that my implant flagged in the first week as suppressed amusement group. By month 2, I'd learned to read it without the implant's help. The carry case triggered it every time I set it on the table. The Drashari Queendom was old, powerful, and thoroughly convinced of both. They controlled 11 star systems and the transit lanes connecting 4 more. Their fleet was large, well-maintained, and absolutely certain of its own competence, which made it dangerous in the conventional way, but also, in my experience, a little brittle. Certainty has a tendency to stop updating. Queen Sarithval was the 37th ruler of her line. She was tall even by Drashari standards. The species averaged about 2 meters, scaled in deep amber and bronze with darker ridge patterning along the skull and dorsal spine, and secondary jaw structures that most humans initially read as threatening, but were actually just how their faces worked. The queen's scales had the slightly dulled quality of extreme age rendered dignified, and she had the manner of someone who had never had to repeat herself. Not arrogant, exactly, just factually unused to a world in which things she said didn't immediately happen. I found her interesting. I find most people interesting. That's either a gift or a defect, depending on your line of work, and in mine it's mostly a gift. The negotiations had been proceeding in what I would describe as the standard Drashari style, which involved the court presenting what they considered obvious terms, me explaining politely that the compact's position required mutual benefit frameworks and structural parity clauses, and the court experiencing a kind of refined bewilderment, as though I'd arrived at their very formal dinner party and begun explaining that I'd brought my own food. It wasn't hostility. Not exactly. It was the bewilderment of people who genuinely could not locate the conceptual category in which the thing I was saying existed. Mutual benefit, Advisor Drental had said to me in month 3, slowly, the way one speaks to someone who has gotten confused. The Queendom's benefit is the alliance. The compact receives the Queendom's benefit of the alliance. This is mutual. The compact appreciates the Queendom's generosity, I said. Our framework requires that benefit flow in both directions. Not the same benefit, different benefits, calibrated to each party's interests. So, for example, the Queendom receives expanded transit access through compact corridors, and the compact receives inclusion in Drashari trade network pricing schedules. Advisor Drental looked at me for a long moment. His secondary eyelids flickered. "You want to trade," he said. "We want an alliance with a trade component," I said. "We want an alliance," he said. "You want to trade." "I think we may be approaching this from different historical frameworks," I said pleasantly, and opened my carry case, which caused 3 junior court officials to exchange a look I was beginning to know well. The carry case was a point of considerable, if private, amusement to the Drashari court. Not because of its contents. The documentation it held was, I'm told, perfectly standard by compact diplomatic standards, but because I used it. The Drashari conducted all diplomatic processes through oral declaration, formal gesture, and the occasional crystalline seal token that encoded agreement in their legal framework. Paper documentation, or anything like it, was what they used for commercial transactions, minor administrative matters, and historical archives. Not for diplomatic negotiations at the level of planetary alliance. The idea that I was bringing paperwork to an alliance summit was, to them, roughly equivalent to a head of state arriving at a state dinner and asking if they could help clear the tables. I knew this. I kept bringing the paperwork. Not because I was trying to make a point. I wasn't. I brought the paperwork because compact diplomatic procedure required it, and because the documentation was, in fact, important. The clause structures in a properly drafted alliance framework protect both parties against future misinterpretation in ways that oral declarations, however formally witnessed, tend not to. I explained this to Advisor Drental in month 1. He had received the explanation with the particular stillness the Drashari deployed, when they were being very polite about finding something absurd. Month 4, the court sent Princess Valdra to observe the sessions. This was, I gathered, a form of mild insult, or possibly an educational gesture, or possibly both. The princess was the queen's youngest daughter, and from what I could piece together from context, not in the direct line of succession. She had 3 older sisters ahead of her. She was sent to observe negotiations the way you might send a junior apprentice to watch a tradesman work. Educational, but not so important a posting that anyone would be upset if it was occasionally tedious. She was 17 years old by Drashari reckoning, which put her at roughly equivalent to a mid-20s human in terms of developmental stage. She was smaller than the adult court officials, her scale coloring not yet fully darkened to the amber bronze of maturity. She still had the lighter copper tones of adolescence at her throat and wrists. She had the long-fingered, careful quality of someone who spent a lot of time watching. She didn't speak in the sessions. She sat in the observer's chair along the eastern wall, very still, and watched. I acknowledged her the first day with a small formal nod, which is what compact protocol required when acknowledging a junior royal in a formal setting. She returned it. After that, we both pretended she wasn't there, which was what the protocol also required, and which I found faintly amusing given that she was quite obviously paying considerably more attention than anyone else in the room. By month 6, I had begun to think of her as my best audience. Month 7, the sessions began to stall more deliberately. The Queen stopped sending Advisor Drental and started attending personally. This was a shift in register. Sarith Val's presence carried a different kind of pressure. The sessions became more formal, which made the carry case elicit a more visible suppressed reaction from the assembled court each time I produced it. Because producing a carry case of documents in the personal presence of the Queen of the Drashari Queendom was, apparently, a thing that had simply never happened before. I set it on the table the same way I always did. The Queen watched me do this in month 7 with an expression my implant categorized as indeterminate, possibly evaluating, possibly amused. Then she began negotiations by informing me that the compact's insistence on what she described as commercial language in a political framework was, while charmingly earnest, unnecessary. The Queendom's protection is not a commodity, she told me. It is a status. You do not purchase a status, you are granted one. We have considerable respect for the Queendom's position, I said. Our framework isn't about purchase. It's about clarity, making sure that both parties understand, in terms that survive changes of government and gaps of time, exactly what they've agreed to and what they can expect. I am the 37th ruler of my line, Queen Sarith Val said. The agreements I make survive. I don't doubt that, I said. This is about the agreements surviving everyone. The secondary eyelids went across in the room, all of them nearly simultaneously, even the princess briefly. We continued. Month 5 they tried a different approach. Rather than Advisor Drental explaining that the alliance itself was the mutual benefit, they sent a more senior counselor, Vethorin, who held something roughly equivalent to the Queendom's Minister of External Relations, to make the same argument in a different register. He had a longer title, a more elaborate dorsal ridge pattern indicating rank, and the smooth, unhurried delivery of someone who had conducted this particular conversation many times before and found it reliably effective. He told me that the Queendom had, in its 4,000 years, absorbed 23 previously independent political entities. All of them, he said, had initially presented frameworks of their own. None of those frameworks were still in use. The Queendom's framework had survived because the Queendom survived, and this was the natural result of aligning with a lasting power, rather than insisting on the relevance of one's own approach. He delivered this not as a threat. His tone throughout was genuinely warm, the warmth of someone sharing genuinely useful historical context with someone who simply didn't have it yet, but as information. Here is how things work. Here is the evidence. The patterns are clear. You may find them useful. I thanked him for the historical overview. I said the compact found the Queendom's record of longevity genuinely impressive. I said our framework was specifically designed to remain functional regardless of the relative size or age of the parties involved, which was why we built it around mutual benefit structures rather than absorption mechanisms. I said I looked forward to continuing the conversation. Counselor Vethorin's secondary eyelids moved twice. He remained warm and collegial throughout. When he left, I opened the carry case and made a note in the month 5 summary. In the margin I wrote, 23 entities, may be worth reviewing what happened to them. I reviewed it. It was not a cheerful history. I made a second note referencing Clause 7. Month 6 was quieter, which in my experience is not the same as less significant. The Queendom's approach shifted from presenting terms to discussing premises. Advisor Drental began asking questions about how the compact operated internally, how its member systems related to each other, how decisions were made when member interests conflicted. The questions were procedural and appropriate, and, I suspected, motivated by someone trying to understand whether the parity model I kept proposing was actually how the compact functioned or whether it was simply how I was presenting it. I answered fully, the compact does work that way. It is not a tidy structure. It has 12 member systems with their own legislative frameworks, 2 associate members with partial voting rights, and a dispute mechanism that has been called various things, none of which are complementary, but which does actually function. I explained this at some length. Advisor Drental listened and took what I interpreted as mental notes, the Drashari not generally making written ones in formal sessions. Month 7, the princess started asking questions through the observer's formal channel. The observer's formal channel was a specific protocol for junior court members in observer positions. They could submit written questions to the presiding official, who could then choose to raise them in session if deemed relevant. It was designed for rare, very brief interventions. The princess submitted 3 questions in month 7, which were a very specific question about the transit corridor access provisions and how they would interact with existing Queendom commercial agreements, a question about the 5-year review mechanism and whether it required full renegotiation or only allowed for modifications, and a question about Clause 7's termination conditions and specifically what constituted a material change in circumstances, as defined in the framework. All 3 questions were precise. All 3 questions were about the parts of my documentation that had the most structural consequence. Advisor Drental raised them in session, as he was obliged to do if they were deemed relevant, and he deemed them relevant because, I suspect, he found them relevant. I answered them in detail. In my peripheral vision in the observer's chair, the princess was very still. After the session in my notes I wrote, "Observer paying close attention, framework level not surface, worth watching." Month 8 began the way months 3 through 7 had ended, with the court presenting terms that assumed compact subordination in all but name, and me explaining, pleasantly, that the compact's framework required structural parity, and the room experiencing the particular polite bewilderment that I had come to think of as our natural resting state. I was not impatient. I want to be clear about this. 8 months is not a long time in the context of an alliance negotiation with a civilization that measures political history in millennia. I had worked longer processes. I was comfortable. I had good lodgings in the embassy quarter. I had learned to enjoy Drashari cuisine, which was heavily mineral in flavoring and took some adjustment, but had a certain austere quality I'd come to appreciate. And I had been sending detailed reports to the compact every 10 days that were, as far as I could tell, being read by at least 2 people. One of whom had sent back a note asking me to please define secondary eyelid suppression in future reports, as not everyone had the relevant biological briefing. I was fine. The Queen, I think, was not fine. Not in any visible way. The Drashari don't display impatience in any register I could read clearly, or possibly they were simply impatient in ways my 8 months of observation hadn't yet taught me to recognize. But month 8 had a different quality than months 3 through 7. There was a pressure to the sessions that hadn't been there before. The court was more formal. The Queen arrived earlier. Advisor Drental, back in attendance to supplement the Queen's own counsel, had begun responding to my carry case with the slightly flattened expression of a man who had been quietly enduring something for a long time. I thought something is moving. Someone somewhere has decided that the timetable needs to change. I thought this on a Tuesday, Galactic Standard. The following Thursday, the Queen played her card. The session was in the Grand Chamber, not the working negotiation room we'd been using for months, but the full state chamber, which seated approximately 300 Drashari officials, advisors, witnesses, and court functionaries. I had been informed that morning that the session would be conducted in formal court setting, which I took to mean the Queen had decided to move from the working phase to a declaratory phase. In Drashari political practice, declarations made in the Grand Chamber in full court were considered binding public commitments. I put on my formal compact diplomatic jacket, the one with the full rank designation, which I'd worn approximately twice in 8 months, and I brought the carry case, because I bring the carry case everywhere, and I went to the Grand Chamber. The court was assembled in full when I arrived. The queen was on the throne. The princess was in the observers' gallery above and to the east, which was where junior royals sat during grand chamber sessions. She was watching me with the attentive quality I had come to recognize. I was shown to the envoy's position, which was a marked circle on the floor about 15 meters from the base of the throne dais. I set the carry case down beside me. Somewhere to my left, I heard the very soft sound of several hundred Drashari court officials, registering the carry case with the collective polite restraint of people who were absolutely not going to react to the carry case, in front of the Queen, in the Grand Chamber. I waited. Queen Scifi allowed a full minute of formal silence before she spoke. "Thomas Okafor," she said. The translation implant caught all of it. Her Drashari came out in my ear as a precise, formal, high-register address. "Envoy of the Compact of Free Systems, you have been a guest of the Queendom for 8 months. You have conducted yourself with courtesy and persistence." She paused here in a way that suggested persistence was meant as a slightly complicated compliment. "The Queendom has reflected on the Compact's position. The Compact is honored by the Queendom's consideration," I said. "Formal register, appropriate to the chamber." "The Queendom has determined," the Queen continued, "that the nature of the obstacle between us is not political, it is structural. The Compact and the Queendom have different frameworks for how alliances are formed, and your framework, while earnest, is not suited to how the Queendom works." "I'm listening," I said. "The Queendom forms its deepest alliances through kin bonds," Queen Scifi said, "not through documents." She let that sit for a moment, and I could feel the weight the court was giving it, the quality of attention that meant something significant was coming. "If you want an alliance, you will marry my daughter." The chamber went very quiet. I stood there in the quiet for a moment and processed what had happened. In Drashari political practice, a kin bond alliance, what they called a veth saral, a household joining, was the highest possible form of alliance structure. A foreign party who entered it became part of the Queen's household. They took the household name. Their independent political standing transferred to the Queendom's framework. Their state of origin became a household ally, not an equal partner, a protected member of the Queendom's extended structure, like a province that had chosen to join rather than been conquered. The kin bond would end 8 months of negotiation, because there would be nothing left to negotiate. The compact would be folded in, politely, permanently, and entirely. The Queen's leverage was absolute, or she thought it was. Either I accepted, the compact was absorbed, or I refused, and the compact had declined a royal offer in open court in front of 300 witnesses, which was not a diplomatic incident one recovered from easily. I thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. "That is a remarkable offer," I said. "Thank you, Your Majesty." The Queen inclined her head. "Before I respond formally," I said, "I want to make sure I understand the custom correctly. In a veth saral, does the princess have a role in the decision, or is this determined at the household level?" The quiet in the chamber changed quality. It had been the silence of a held breath. Now it was a slightly different silence, the silence of a room recalibrating. "The veth saral is declared by the head of household," the Queen said after a brief pause. "The household's determination is binding." "Of course," I said. "I ask because, in compact custom, a marriage proposal, even a political one, is customarily put to the prospective spouse before a formal response is given, not because their agreement is required for the political framework to operate, simply as a matter of courtesy. I wouldn't want to accept without having asked her first." I looked up toward the observers' gallery. "Princess Valdra," I said, "I realize this is somewhat irregular. But as I understand it, you're the party being proposed, and I think it would be rude of me not to ask directly, what do you think of this arrangement?" The silence in the chamber became a different thing entirely. 300 Drashari officials, advisors, witnesses, and court functionaries processed what had just happened. The Queen processed what had just happened. And from the observer's gallery, Princess Valdra, who had spent 8 months sitting very still and watching, and who had not spoken once in any of these sessions, looked at me with an expression my implant declined to categorize, and then looked at her mother. She said something in Drashari, high formal register, which my implant caught and translated. I have several thoughts on this, mother. That was how the session ended, technically. What happened next is more difficult to summarize concisely, because it involved approximately 6 hours of the Drashari court discovering that the princess had, in fact, developed quite detailed thoughts about the queendom's alliance strategy, the Vethsaral system as applied to foreign diplomats, the question of whether a kin bond that absorbed the compact would actually serve the queendom's interests in the longer term, and a series of related topics that I gathered she had been working through quietly for the better part of 8 months, while sitting in the observer's chair along the eastern wall. I did not participate in this portion of the proceedings. I was not asked to. I was offered a seat in a side room with tea, Drashari tea, which was mineral forward and required getting used to, and I sat there and drank it and listened to the sounds of the full court session, continuing at considerable volume and occasional interruption through the chamber door. I should be clear, I had not planned this. I want that on record, in whatever record these events end up in. I asked the princess a question because it was the honest, natural question to ask. In 34 years of diplomatic service, I have learned that the most dangerous thing you can do in a foreign court is assume that the obvious social dynamics you're seeing are the complete social dynamics. Clearly someone of standing was sitting in that observer's chair for 8 months. Clearly they had paid more attention than most people in the room. The decent thing when you've been told you're to marry someone is to ask them how they feel about it. I did the decent thing. The consequences were, I'll admit, more extensive than I had predicted. The princess's objections were, as I gathered through the door and later from Advisor Drental's somewhat dazed summary, substantial. She did not object to the alliance. She objected to the method. Specifically, she objected to the Vethsaral as a framework for an alliance with the compact on the grounds that absorbing the compact into the queendom's household structure would forfeit the actual advantages of the relationship. Independent compact, trade access, compact military positioning in systems the queendom couldn't easily reach, and the political flexibility that came from having an equal ally rather than a subordinate province. She also, apparently, had a number of things to say about the parity framework I'd been proposing for 8 months. Positive things. Advisor Drental came to find me in the side room after approximately 2 hours. He sat down, accepted a cup of Drashari tea with the mechanical quality of a man who had been caught in a weather event and was slowly recognizing it, and looked at me for a moment. "She has read your documentation," he said. "Has she?" "All of it, 8 months of it." He paused. "She appears to have opinions about Clause 7 of your monthly draft that I had not anticipated her having." "Clause 7 has a clean termination framework," I said. "Some people find that reassuring. It means both parties can exit the alliance if circumstances change, without the exit being treated as a political rupture." "The Queen," Advisor Drental said, "does not like Clause 7. "I know. We've discussed it." "The princess," he said, "thinks Clause 7 is its most important feature." He drank his tea, I drank mine. "How is the session going?" I asked. "It is going," Advisor Drental said, very carefully, in a direction that I had not prepared for this morning. I nodded sympathetically. I genuinely felt for him. He'd been managing this process for 8 months with great professionalism under significant institutional pressure, and the morning had taken a turn that was not in any briefing document he had received. We sat in companionable silence for a moment. "If I may ask," Advisor Drental said, "when you asked the princess for her opinion, was that a diplomatic strategy?" "It was courtesy," I said. "Someone told me I was going to marry her. It seemed right to ask how she felt about it." He looked at me. "In Drashari practice, that question is not asked." "I know, your custom makes sense within your political framework. In ours, not asking would be considered disrespectful of the person being proposed." I paused. I wasn't trying to cause difficulties. I just didn't want to be rude to her. Advisor Drental absorbed this. He had the expression of a man integrating information that was technically simple and somehow making everything more complicated. "The princess," he said slowly, "has wanted to be in these sessions for 8 months. I suspected something like that. She has been in the observer's chair." "Yes. We thought she was learning, observing as junior court members do." He paused. "She was. She was also preparing her own position," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes. She's smart," I said. "She asked good questions in the early months. I noticed she was following the specifics, not just the general shape of things. Month 3 she started cross-referencing my documentation with your trade records, I think, based on a couple of the questions she asked through the formal observer's channel. Small questions, procedurally appropriate so nobody thought much of them. But they were precise." Advisor Drental put down his teacup. "You noticed." "I notice things. It's most of what I do." He sat with that. From behind the chamber doors the session continued. The princess's voice was audible, though the words weren't clear, and then the queen's voice, lower and more measured, and then what sounded like a point of formal legal precedent being raised by someone at the senior counselor level. "She cited your Clause 7, Advisor Drental said, as though this was still surprising him. "She cited it in formal court, in the Queen's presence." "It's a good clause," I said. "It is extremely unusual," he said, "for a junior royal in the observer's position to introduce foreign documentation into a formal court proceeding." "Is it allowed?" He considered. "There is no precedent prohibiting it," he said, "because there is no precedent for it at all." He refilled his tea. I had already decided I was going to wait this out as long as it took. I was in no hurry. I had good tea, a comfortable chair, and the patience of a man who had spent 8 years negotiating infrastructure rights with the Pelari Collective. The Pelari dispute, for context, had involved a disagreement about whether 7 transit waypoints in a contested corridor belonged to Pelari infrastructure jurisdiction, or were technically sovereign compact territory under a treaty signed 90 years prior that the Pelari claimed had been superseded, and which the compact maintained had not. There were 48 people across 6 delegations who had worked on that process for the better part of a decade, and none of them could have summarized it cleanly at any given point during its duration. It had concluded in a joint jurisdiction framework that pleased nobody completely and irritated everyone approximately equally, which in my experience is the signature of a durable agreement. 8 months negotiating an alliance with a queen who had never once in 4,000 years been told no was, comparatively, a calm morning. I helped myself to more tea. Through the door the voices rose and fell. At one point there was a very extended silence that had the quality of a room absorbing something unexpected, followed by what I recognized as formal legal procedural language, the kind of citation and precedent register that Drashari court protocol deployed when an argument needed anchoring in established law. I couldn't make out the specifics. The walls of the Drashari Grand Chamber were thick, designed for ceremony rather than for eavesdropping. I thought about the termination clause. I thought about whether the transit access provision needed cleaner language around the outer systems, which was something I'd noted in my month 6 documentation review and then left for a later session. I thought about whether the 5-year review mechanism should include a provision for extraordinary review in cases of significant political change, which was the kind of thing that was easy to skip and then difficult to address later. I made a note about it in my month 8 documentation. In the 4th hour, a junior court official knocked and entered and asked, with the slightly stunned formality of someone executing an instruction they hadn't expected to receive, whether I would be willing to re-enter the chamber to clarify the termination clause. I said I would be happy to clarify any part of the documentation. I picked up the carry case. The junior court official looked at it, and something in his expression suggested that the carry case had achieved a different status in the last 4 hours than it had held that morning. I went back into the grand chamber. It was different. The formal court session had relaxed somewhat, not dissolved, but shifted. The princess was no longer in the observer's gallery. She was on the floor of the chamber, standing near the left side of the dais, in a position that was not the observer's position, and was not quite the counselor's position either, but was somewhere between the two that had apparently been improvised over the last several hours. 300 officials had realigned subtly to accommodate a new center of gravity in the room. Queen Sarithval was on the throne. She looked at me when I entered with an expression that was not the expression she had worn that morning, which had been the expression of someone certain of their position. This was a more thoughtful expression. It contained several things I couldn't read and one or two that I could. One of the things I could read was something I'd seen before in long negotiations. When one party comes to the end of a position they'd thought was solid and starts looking at the floor under it. "Envoy Akafar," the Queen said, "thank you for your patience." "Of course, Your Majesty." "My daughter has raised a number of points," the Queen said, "regarding the documentation you have submitted over the past 8 months. In particular, she has raised questions about your mutual benefit framework. She suggests, and the senior counselor's office has found it difficult to refute, that the Queendom's interests are more specifically served by the structural parity model than by the Vethsaral integration." The Queen paused. "She is persuasive." "She's thorough," I said. "That's usually more useful than persuasive." The princess to my left made a very small sound that was not quite a laugh and was absolutely a positive reaction to this, which she controlled in approximately half a second. She was learning. She was going to be very good at this. "I would like," the Queen said, "to revisit your month 3 draft. Specifically, you mentioned a clarification of the termination clause." "I'd be happy to walk through it," I said. I opened the carry case. The 300 officials in the room watched me do this with an entirely different quality of attention than they'd given it that morning. The carry case, which had spent 8 months being privately hilarious, had spent the last 4 hours being quoted from informal court in front of the Queen. It was still the same carry case, but things that get cited in grand chamber proceedings tend to acquire a different character. I walked through the termination clause. I also walked through the trade access provisions, the transit corridor terms, the mutual defense consultation framework, which I'd been careful to call a consultation framework rather than a defense pact because it was and the distinction mattered, and the review mechanism at the 5-year mark. The princess asked 3 questions, each of them precise and well-positioned. The senior counselor asked 2. Advisor Drental asked 1. The Queen asked none but listened to all of them. We were there for 2 more hours. At the end of the 2nd hour, the Queen said, "We will review the month 3 framework, formally. With the senior counselor's office and with my daughter," she paused. "We will respond within 10 days. The compact thanks the Queendom for its consideration," I said. I packed up the carry case. The session closed. I walked out of the grand chamber and back through the formal corridors to the embassy quarter, and I thought about several things on the walk, including the termination clause and the princess's questions, and the quality of the Drashari tea. I sent a report to the compact that evening. I kept it brief. Session conducted in formal court, progress on structural framework. I didn't mention the marriage proposal. I mentioned it in a footnote categorized as procedural development resolved without incident. The response 10 days later was not the Queen's voice. It was Advisor Drental in written form, which was another first. In 8 months, all substantive communications had been oral. He sent me a document, a Drashari document, crystalline seal and all, but also, and this was the part I looked at twice, accompanied by a written summary in compact standard of the terms they were prepared to agree to. They had written it down. Not because I'd asked them to, not as a concession. The note from Advisor Drental, which was careful and formal and somewhat stiffly worded, explained that the princess had suggested it would aid in the clarity and longevity of the agreement. The senior counselor's office had reviewed and found no precedent prohibiting it. The Queen had approved. The terms were close to my monthly draft. Not identical, there were modifications, some of which I liked and some of which I'd need to negotiate, and one of which was almost certainly the princess's work, given its specific focus on the 5-year review mechanism and the trade access provisions in the outer systems. But it was a working document. It was something we could build from. I sent back my response. I noted my agreement to the overall framework, flagged the 3 items I wanted to revisit, and proposed a working session the following week with the senior counselor's office and whichever party the Queendom designated. The designated party, when I arrived the following week, was Princess Valdra. She was sitting at the working table, the small table, in the working room we'd used for months, not the grand chamber, with her own documentation in front of her. Not crystalline tokens, paper, or something that functioned like paper in the Drashari framework, a thin pressed mineral sheet they used for commercial records. She had written her working notes on it. She looked at me when I came in with the carry case and said, in formal Drashari, that my implant caught as carefully chosen but slightly nervous. I understand my question at the session created some difficulty for you. Not for me, I said. I sat down across from her and opened the carry case. It created some difficulty for Advisor Drental. He recovered well. The secondary eyelids flickered. She was suppressing something. I had been wanting to speak for some time, she said. I could tell, I said. She looked at me. You noticed. You were paying attention differently than everyone else in the room, the kind of attention that's getting ready to do something. I sorted my documentation. I didn't know what you were getting ready to do, but I thought it was worth asking. She was quiet for a moment. In our court, the observer's position is passive. It is not protocol for the observer to contribute. I know, I said, but when I asked you a direct question, the passive position ended. A direct question requires a direct answer. I wasn't trying to maneuver you into speaking. I genuinely wanted to know how you felt about being proposed for a political marriage without your knowledge. I found the clause I was looking for. How did you feel about it? Surprised, she said. My mother does not consult me on these things. A pause. She consults me on fewer things than she should. That may change, I said. She's been watching you this week. The princess looked down at her notes. She has asked me to lead the working sessions, she said. That is also unprecedented. You earned it, I said. You spent 8 months doing the work. The documentation proves it. She looked at the carry case. I read all of it, she said. Advisor Drental told me. I thought it was very clear, she said. The mutual benefit structure. The reason your Clause 7 works is because it removes the question of whether the alliance is worth maintaining. It creates a regular opportunity to simply confirm that it is, without the political cost of termination feeling like betrayal. That is, she paused, choosing her Drashari carefully. That is not how we think about alliances. We think about them as permanent, which means when they end, it is catastrophic rather than ordinary. Most of our diplomatic failures in the compact's early history were alliances that should have been renegotiated but couldn't be, I said, because there was no clean path and nobody wanted to be the one who ended a permanent commitment. The termination clause isn't pessimism. It's maintenance. She wrote something on her pressed mineral sheet. I waited. Shall we start with items 4 and 7, she said. That works for me, I said. We worked for 4 hours. She was thorough and quick, and once she was comfortable that I wasn't going to be surprised by directness, increasingly direct. She caught 2 things I'd glossed over in the month 3 draft that I would have had to come back to later. She proposed a modification to the trade access provision that was actually better than my original language, and I told her so. She looked momentarily surprised to be told that, which told me something about the court environment she'd been working in. In the 3rd hour, she paused over the extraordinary review provision I'd added to my month 8 notes, the one I'd been considering in the side room, and looked at it for a moment. You added this today, she said. This morning, while I was waiting. She looked at me. You were sitting in the side room for 4 hours while the court session was ongoing, and you were working on the documentation. I had my carry case, I said. There's always something worth tightening. She made a note on her pressed mineral sheet. After a moment she said, the extraordinary review provision, would it cover a change of ruling household? Yes, I said. That's precisely the kind of significant political change it's meant for. Both parties would have the option to formally review whether the alliance terms still serve their interests under the new configuration. Not to dissolve, to confirm or modify. And if they confirm, she said, the continuity is documented. Correct. The agreement isn't assumed to carry through automatically, it's actively renewed, which sounds like more work but actually produces a more stable long-term structure. She wrote something, and I noticed it was more than a note. It was a full paragraph, which she wrote with the considered pace of someone putting together a formal argument rather than a reminder. She was, I realized, already drafting the documentation she would present to the senior counselor's office. She had started before the session was technically over. I thought, she is going to be very good at this for a very long time, and the queendom is going to find that either extremely useful or extremely inconvenient, depending on how quickly it adjusts. She sat at the head of the table and listened, and at the end she said to the princess, "Write the summary for Drental's office." Then she looked at me and said, "My daughter has better instincts than I credited." She spent 8 months preparing, I said. That's usually what good instincts look like if you look back far enough. The queen was quiet for a moment. Her secondary eyelids moved in a way I didn't have a category for. The queendom will sign the framework, she said, in the format you've proposed, with the modifications agreed today. The compact will be honored, I said. There is one condition, she said. The princess will lead the implementation council. I hadn't expected that. That seems like an excellent use of her preparation, I said. The queen looked at her daughter. Something passed between them that was not in any register my implant was equipped to catch. Then the queen stood, inclined her head to me at a depth that advisor Drental later told me was reserved for political equals, and left the room. The princess and I sat in the working room for another few minutes. She was writing the summary. "May I ask you something?" she said without looking up. "Yes." "When you asked me in the grand chamber, did you know what would happen?" "No," I said honestly. "I asked because it was the right thing to do. I didn't know you had opinions about Clause 7. I didn't know you had 8 months of preparation behind you. I just knew that your mother had told me I was going to marry you, and that seemed like the kind of thing you ought to have a say in." She finished her line of notes. "It is very strange," she said, "that the thing that changed everything was courtesy." "It usually is," I said, "or the absence of it." I signed the framework 6 days later. Full mutual benefit structure, parity clauses, trade provisions, the 5-year review mechanism with the princess's modification, the extraordinary review provision I drafted in the side room, and Clause 7 intact. In the compact's records, it was filed as a standard bilateral alliance, which it was, except for the 8 months of negotiation and the afternoon in the Grand Chamber, and the 6 hours the Drashari court spent in session while I drank tea in the side room. The file note in the compact system read, "Alliance secured, standard terms, no significant incidents." I have sometimes wondered what the compact system would say if it knew about the marriage proposal. Probably it would have a category for it. The system has a category for most things. I suspect it would have filed it under unusual diplomatic event, outcome positive, no further action required, which would have been accurate and would have captured approximately none of what actually happened. In the footnote I had written procedural development, resolved without incident. I added, on reflection, one more line. Recommend Princess Valdra as primary queendom contact for implementation phase. She has read the documentation. Advisor Drental sent me a farewell message the morning I left. It was formal and courteous and said all the appropriate things. At the end, after the formal close, there was a postscript. It said, "The carry case. I understand now why you brought it." I sent back, "Good documentation survives everything." He didn't respond to that, but I thought, reading nothing into the silence, that he probably agreed. The princess sent nothing. That was correct protocol. She was in the implementation council now, and formal correspondence would come through the council's channel. But when I was walking to the departure gate through the Drashari Capital's transit center, I passed a crystalline information terminal. Someone had attached a small piece of pressed mineral sheet to it, folded once. I didn't know if it was meant for me. I took it. It said in Drashari, Clause 7, thank you. I put it in the carry case. It's still there.